All right, now you get a lecture from a white guy about Black Power. Specifically, we're going to talk about Stokely Carmichael, Angela Davis, maybe a little reference to Assata Shakur. These are all individuals who had some connection with the Black Panthers. Assata Shakur was Black Panther, now exiled in Cuba. Recently, and this ties up with the Angela Davis reading, recently, I guess in the past year or so, she was re-identified as a terrorist and put on the top 10 list of the FBI's list of important terrorists in the world. Just hanging out in Cuba like being a regular person, and yet they re-added her to the terrorist list. This is happening also at a time when, so Black Lives Matter, of course, is, I suppose, still a growing movement, organization. And the FBI, we should assume from the very beginning that every organization like this, any kind of radical union, any kind of organization pushing for the rights of people of color is going to be infiltrated by the police. And so we should have assumed this about Black Lives Matter before, and in fact, we did assume this. But now it's public knowledge that the FBI has done that, and that they're internally using a term called Black Identity Extremists to designate Black Lives Matter activists. And by calling them extremists, they justify targeting them, removing certain of their rights to privacy, attempting to compromise them and maybe eventually arrest them or turn them into snitches for the FBI. So there's a criminalization of black activism similar to the criminalization that took place in the late 1960s and the early 1970s, at which point, in case you don't know, the FBI ran a program called COINTELPRO, which did all kinds of nasty stuff. It urged, for example, Martin Luther King to kill himself. They sent letters urging him to do that. They forged documents turning certain members of, say, the Black Panther Party against other members. This is one of the things that happened to Huey Newton. And they outright assassinated people. They opened up Fred Hampton's door and they shot him, I don't remember what it is, 20-some times in his bed. This is your government. This is your police force. Okay, anyway, so these are all three people with some kind of connection to the Black Panther Party, but only Assata Shakur was a member. Angela Davis and Stokely Carmichael, maybe Stokely was a member for a while, but they were sort of fellow travelers. They, in a lot of ways, were important supporters and probably even people who built the Black Panther Party. Stokely was invited at one point to be honorary chairman of the party. I'm not remembering right now whether he did that or not. Anyway, so we have these three individuals, and so we're talking about the period of Black Power, which is the period that comes directly after civil rights. And so at this point in the class, we've got a lot of really good documentary footage that we can check out too. So the Black Power mixtape is awesome. All kinds of raw, original footage, much of which you won't even be familiar with. And it starts off with a whole lot about Stokely Carmichael, and towards the end you get a whole lot about Angela Davis. Angela Davis, of course, is still around. She's a professor, I think, at UC Santa Cruz. Stokely Carmichael changed his name to Kwame Ture. Assata Shakur, that is a name that she selected as well. I'm forgetting what her original name was. Joanne, I'm forgetting her last name. They decided how they wanted to be called. So what I'm going to give you is basically based on the specific speech that Stokely Carmichael gave at Morgan State, which I asked you to read, and this short chapter from one of Angela Davis' newer books, Freedom is a Constant Struggle. And it's a chapter on Michael Brown, and it talks specifically about the use of language. This is the connection between these two texts. They both deal with terms and the defining of terms. General introduction to the period of Black Power can best be had by looking at the Black Power mixtape. But the first thing to know is that, of course, there's the civil rights movement from the late 1950s through the 1960s. The United States involvement in Vietnam is growing through this period. Violent suppression of civil rights protesters is happening. And then there's this wave of assassinations. JFK, Bobby Kennedy, and then Martin Luther King. I might even have that out of order. But they shot King. And this is sort of how the Black Power mixtape starts. It's like, well, that was our hope. That was our nonviolent hope. That's how we were going to integrate. That's how we were going to do it civilly. But you shot our civil leader. You shot nonviolence. They destroyed nonviolence. We didn't do it, we being the black community. They did it. They killed King. Now they've demanded that there have to be some kind of other tactics, and the whole language of revolution becomes quite central to Black Power figure. Most famous group affiliated with the Black Power movement is the Black Panthers. Stokely himself comes out of a previous civil rights era organization called SNCC, the Southern Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. But they changed the title of that organization later on in the 1960s, I think, to Southern National Coordinating Committee, because they didn't want to be thought of as nonviolent anymore. They could no longer advocate that the only possible way for change to happen is through nonviolence. They could no longer say everybody ought to sit still and take it if they're being beaten. That's no longer the position that the Black Power movement, or the Stokely Carmichael in particular, who is the first person to start regularly using that phrase. I don't know if he originates it. He's usually credited with it. They orient themselves towards what I would nowadays call something like community self-defense. They're associated with violence, and you can see, everybody calls to mind these pictures of the Black Panthers, like either the ones with like Huey and Bobby Seale standing in their super handsome, black leather jackets and their hats with shotguns out next to the Oakland PD. That was a period that lasted maybe like 6 months before California changed the gun laws to make that impossible. And then you picture maybe Black Panthers in uniform, like marching in kind of militaristic fashion. That also is about the first year of the Panthers. That organization lasts for another 12, 13 years. And what it really does, it is interested in community self-defense. It thinks that black communities in particular ought to arm themselves in order to deal with white vigilantes and with cops. And they think it likely, and I tend to agree, that fewer people are going to be shot in a community that is armed. So there is this kind of affiliation with the means of violence, this affirmation of the right to use violence, but as self-defense. And the real emphasis is about self-defense and community autonomy. That's what the Black Power movement wanted. It wanted to arm and train its population, but for defense. And then it wanted its own schools. It wanted to run its own schools, because think about all the stories that talk about the legitimacy of a racist government, the legitimacy of a genocidal westward expansion, the legitimacy of discovery of the Americas by the Spaniards who then genocided them. What's taught in schools, or the sort of models of blackness that are offered in the general media and in schools, which cause black people to entertain the idea that, well, maybe there is something different about them, or lesser about them, or they got welfare queens, they got drug problems, they only make good athletes. All these ideological functions pass very importantly through the schools. So if you want to liberate a community, perhaps that community needs to control its own schools. They also advocated for the control of the police. They did not want Oakland police in their neighborhoods. They wanted to field their own police within each neighborhood. So in a way, they're not an anarchist organization because they're hierarchical. They modeled themselves a whole lot, and here I'm talking specifically about the Panthers, modeled themselves a whole lot on Mao Zedong, who is an advocate of hierarchy, discipline, and order. But the Black Panther Party, when they lay out their rules, they copy them straight from Mao's Little Red Book. So they're not anarchist in this respect, and they have officers and hierarchy and rank. But the goals that they were shooting for, Bobby Seale, I think in particular, community control, real people power, grassroots power, local control over local areas. These are long-term, at least revolutionary goals, and typically anarchist-style goals. Anyway, so Stokely starts off in SNCC doing work for civil rights, for the ending of segregation, and for the pushing away of obstacles to the registration of black voters, and so the possibility of a black vote. That's what he does first. He's in his early 20s. You can find out all about this. You can see his mom and him hanging out. There's beautiful footage in the Black Power mixtape. So what I want to talk about is two real things that Carmichael focuses on. One is the question of defining terms, and this is something that Angela Davis looks at too. The second thing is about the specific question of violence. And these overlap because violence is a term, right? And we use violence unequally to refer to different things. Like, for example, you might think that there are certain neighborhoods in Los Angeles that you wouldn't want to go to late at night because there's violence there. So when certain people mug you or jump you and rape you, that's violence, right? But when a police officer shoots whoever dead, let's say, like, what is it, Tamir Rice in Cleveland, Ohio. Cops, you've seen that footage, the cops show up, jump out of their car, the kid's dead. He's like 12, he's a kid. Dead within like 20 seconds. They just blow him away. But common usage within the media would not refer to that as violence. That's a police shooting, perhaps. And generally speaking, when the police beat somebody, when they imprison somebody, when they shoot somebody, we don't use the word violence. We instead use the word duty or the use of force. We'll say, well, you know, the security personnel or the police, they were compelled to use force. But we don't say they engaged in violence. So violence overlaps with this question of the defining of terms. What Carmichael says to begin with, I mean, generally speaking, you know, I gave you this speech of his because I want you to think about your own position. You know, so he's at Morgan State, all black school, and he's just letting the students have it. He's like, you know, y'all are doing it wrong. You're getting to advance, supposedly. You're rising perhaps above the educational level of your families. You're gonna have this degree, but then what you're doing with it sucks. You're gonna go get a job, and see, this applies to y'all just as well as it applies to Stokely's audience. That's the reason I'm giving it to you, to provoke you and to have you try to give a response to this seminal figure. It's like the idea that you're going to go and get jobs and work together with white folks in corporate America and get a house in a nice neighborhood and have a whole bunch of like nice cars and nice outfits, and thus you will have elevated yourself. That's all wrong. It's all wrong, because what you should be doing is going back to your community and empowering it, not moving out and whiteifying yourself. You know, he also specifically attacks black fraternities. He's like, you know, so the black people showed up at schools, they saw that the white people had fraternities. What did they do? They made their own fraternities, which is an imitation of white culture and so problematic for Carmichael. But what's even worse is that they then made multiple fraternities, and one of those fraternities was typically for lighter skinned people and the other for darker skinned people. He's like, what the fuck? You're engaged in just the same racism that the oppressing class is engaged in. Come on, people. So he's trying to rouse his audience to be involved in revolutionary activity and truly oppositional activity, instead of just integrating themselves into a machine, which is problematic from the very beginning. And so my reason in giving you this text is to challenge you to do the same thing. Now, in terms of content, Carmichael's primary theme in this speech is the defining of terms. He says, okay, look, the first thing that a powerful people needs, and the first thing that a powerful people needs is the power to define its own terms. It has to be able to determine what things mean, what things have value, what's good and what's bad, what should be pursued and what should not. What is the meaning, for example, of blackness? What is the meaning, for example, of whiteness? What is the meaning, for example, of violence? And to tie in Angela Davis, what's the meaning of something like terrorism? You can't just accept terms as they are given to you, because if you just accept the terms from your environment, which in this class I would refer to as the ideological environment, which is always primarily produced by the ruling power, by the ruling class. And of course there will be little like percolations of alternative ideology, just insofar as there really is a revolutionary movement. If there really are people engaging in oppositional activity, they can generate ideology too. But for the most part, the mainstream opinions, the received wisdom, the common sense will always be composed of terms, concepts, principles which benefit the order as it now stands. So you can't just accept what you're told about what's violent and what's not. You shouldn't just accept the idea that all good resistance is non-violent resistance, and that anything that violates that idea of non-violence is unacceptable, because there's even contradictions there, right? We accept that. That's our ideological ambience. That's what percolates, like sifts into our brains, just because our brains walk through physical spaces with real TVs and real people repeating things that they've heard. But according to that, you know, nonviolence is the only acceptable thing. And yet, as Stokely says, we have ROTC on our campus, and yet nobody talks about that. being violence on campus. Those people are, some of you maybe, being taught to kill, being taught the art of killing, the art of spatial control and the delivery of force. But we're not supposed to call that violence. We're supposed to embrace nonviolence and say that's the only good way to go about things. But we're not supposed to make this apply to cops. We don't ask that cops behave non-violently in the carrying out of their duties. But we don't call what they do violence either. So we shouldn't just receive the terms that are given to us. We have to evaluate those terms. We have to construct our own terms. And we have to construct the terms that are going to empower us, that are really thought through, that line up with our real objectives, and that don't just parrot what we've been told. Because Carmichael's view is that a population that parrots the important terms that it has been given without any critical reflection, without taking the agent's role in determining what things mean, will always be an enslaved population. You have to determine your own terms. I'll just give a couple of examples here, 2 or 3 of them. Take Angela Davis, for example. In the chapter that I gave you from her, she talks about the term terrorism or terrorist. And she writes specifically about the designation of Assata Shakur as a terrorist. The word terrorist is used all over the place, if you haven't noticed. The first thing to know about terrorists is that, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, right? It's a question of choosing sides. So we're supposed to understand, say, Hezbollah or Hamas. We're supposed to call those terrorist organizations. These, if you don't know about these are to some extent guerrilla organizations. Hezbollah with some connections to Iran, operating largely out of Lebanon. Hamas in the Palestinian territories that are opposed to Israeli occupation of Palestinian territory. Hamas was at one point, a few years back, democratically elected into positions of power within Palestine and the Palestinian Authority, which is a sort of puppet regime typically for the Israeli government. And then the Israelis and then the United States just refused to recognize that democratic election and proceeded to assassinate the leadership, again, some of the leadership of Hamas. Ronald Reagan was in office when Al-Qaeda was being constructed. The U.S., together with Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, we constructed Al-Qaeda, and that's not a matter in dispute. Everybody knows that. Osama bin Laden was a wealthy Saudi person who used all his influence, connections, and money in order to build a jihadi movement, a fighting movement, an Islamist fighting movement in Afghanistan. But it was done mostly with United States money, United States guns, and we went through the Saudis and the Pakistanis, ISI, that's their intelligence service, and established this group of fighters, and we did it to lure Russia into occupying and fighting in Afghanistan. We wanted to produce a Vietnam for them. And this is a rare occasion where, a United States military strategy actually sort of worked. Being stuck in Afghanistan is one of the significant factors that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Probably not the most important one, but it was one. So we constructed this proxy force to fight against the Russians. And there's footage, you can look it up, there's footage of Ronald Reagan hanging out with key figures within Al-Qaeda and the Taliban and referring to them as freedom fighters because we wanted to use them for that purpose, because we set them up to be the opponents of Russia, and anybody who's the enemy of our enemy is a freedom fighter, right? Anybody who's against communism is free. There's a term for you to define. Don't just accept that freedom has a meaning. Every damn country in the world wants to convince you that their system is the only one conducive to freedom, that it is identical with freedom. And yet, of course, they're not. The Taliban fighting for freedom, its variety of freedom, imprisons lots of women, for example. And then later on, these same organizations become terrorists. So Davis makes the point that, look, in the United States, or say in the United States and in the United States broader geopolitical dealings, the word terrorism and terrorist has a particular role. When you call somebody a terrorist, this is how I think about it. When you call somebody a terrorist, what you mean is that they are irrational. They're motivated by hate or some kind of delusional, psychotic thing, which is not discursive reason. And because they're fundamentally irrational and fundamentally violent, terrorism is always an embrace of violence, where violence is the bad guy thing and not just the judicious use of force, which is what we think we're doing, and all our allies. They judiciously use force. All our enemies, they're violent and they're terrorists. Because these alleged terrorists can't be reasoned with, the only possible response to them is the use of force. But we wouldn't call it violence because we're doing it. It's force, right? Calling anybody terrorist allows violence against them to happen. And in the United States, the use of the term terrorist imperils people of Muslim descent and culture, because you're building this ideological identity which regular old thoughtless people then project upon people of a particular sort. So terrorist pretends to be a non-racist category, but it ends up actually being a racist category. It becomes an anti-Muslim and anti-Arab category. The use of the words terrorist justifies the Israeli occupation of Palestine, because every organization that lobbies or that fights for the liberation of territories that were objectively taken over by Israel in 1948 and then in 1967. The 67 war, the borders of Israel expanded. Anybody who fights against that, we can call them a terrorist. And so in this weird circular logic, that justifies the Israeli presence, military presence, police presence, extraction of resources, exploitation of labor, all this kind of colonial stuff, which is really what's going on in Israeli-occupied Palestine. It justifies it all as totally legit because, well, there's just a bunch of terrorists there. Talk about terrorism and terrorists justifies the closing down of immigration. So Donald Trump's big move to isolate the U.S. and to cut off flows, racist decisions about who's going to come, right? That's justified under the heading of terrorism. And if you look at Ferguson, which is something that we are going to talk about more and that Angela Davis is interested in this text, you can see the super militarization of police. There's two answers to this, but why are American police increasingly militarized? The pragmatic, empirical sort of answer is, well, there's all this military gear, but there's such a strong lobbyist relationship between the military-industrial complex, that means all the manufacturers and in-between agencies of arms, such a tight relationship between the manufacturers and the military, who are the buyers, that it's pretty much guaranteed that there will always be new purchases of equipment. They have to sell more equipment because those companies got to get more tax money into their coffers, and that will be guaranteed because there's a revolving door between the military and military manufacturers. That's a sort of empirical answer. Oh yeah, and so this generates a surplus. And what do you do with the surplus? Oh, you can give it to the cops. And at this point, the cops, this is a part of a larger movement. The cops become a sort of part of a large-scale security apparatus. So it's not only that they're getting more gear, they're also getting more integrated in terms of information flow, in terms of command structures. They're getting more integrated into one overall, really frightening police state. That's one variety of answer. But then there's the ideological answer. Why is it necessary? This is how a congressperson will likely respond to a constituent who has worries about the hyper-militarization of the police where they live. They'll say, well, really this is about terrorist threats. Because we have terrorists and we have a terrorist problem, it's very necessary that the police be ready to deal with full-on military-style attacks. But then, of course, the armed police don't deal with terrorists because there aren't hardly any. And of course, when we talk about people who might want to attack the U.S., we never talk about why. What did the U.S. do to them? What is the U.S.'s role with respect to their government? How is the U.S. supporting dictatorial regimes all over the world? Who that they know did the U.S. bomb? We never ask these questions. But anyway, there's precious few terrorists in the U.S., and even the FBI is way more likely to investigate organizations like Black Lives Matter, or when it's being a little bit more honest, it'll investigate the KKK and it'll investigate neo-Nazi organizations, the 3%ers, militia movements. But that was all before Trump. Now all those organizations, those like militarized white power organizations, are integrated with sheriff's departments and stuff like that. Anyway, they don't actually use that weaponry against terrorists because there aren't any to be found. They use them against poor black people. So Davis' point, Carmichael's general point is, don't just use terms like that. Don't just accept terms like that. When you see that Assata Shakur has been designated a terrorist, that should make you freak out and think, like, what the fuck? Look her up. Find out what she's been up to. She's been like, shopping at outdoor markets, and that's it. The only thing that the FBI could lay at her feet was that she still says that black people in America are treated very poorly and that they ought to liberate themselves. Watch out for these dominant terms. What about black power? This is Stokely's focus. Like, what about the term black power? He's like, okay, first thing for black people is don't just accept what the mainstream vibe tells you about black power, because what it's going to tell you about black power is it's violence. It's about violence. That's it. And of course, in this like dominant ideological logic, we all know that violence is bad. It's bad. And therefore that black power is bad. Carmichael's like, okay, let's back off. Let's realize that the use of the term violence is completely equivocal. And let's not define black power in terms of violence. He's like, okay, here's my position. Here's the position of a number of people that he agrees with. And it's even like where Martin Luther King got, shortly before he got shot. It's like, the only thing that makes us violent is that we are not willing to condemn young black guys who throw rocks and bottles at cops. We're not gonna. We understand their situation. When we look at James Baldwin shortly, Baldwin will say, like, the thing that produces rebellions and riots, the thing that produces forced relationships and violent relationships within black communities and ghetto communities and between black people and police is the fact that large populations, this is largely true for black populations, but it's also, of course, true for Latino populations and certain portions of Asian population, and where I come from in rural Ohio, in Appalachia, there's a whole lot of poor white folk, and the thing that they all share in common is a sense that they're never going to get anywhere. Doesn't matter what you do. Maybe there's this like pipe dream, and this is a racist pipe dream, that you can get out of the ghetto by being a rapper or by being an athlete. But of course, the people who make it out are a very small portion, and everybody else just sort of knows that they're stuck. That's what produces the violence. Go read Frantz Fanon. You want to understand why certain kids, and it's true for Palestinians too, right? They like to throw rocks at Israeli soldiers because they're stuck, because they're colonized, because they're subjected to regular ongoing violence. So Stokely's point is the black power position is not to condemn that kind of activity, but that's not what black power means. It doesn't mean just random, rampant violence. It means empowerment of black communities and autonomization, the taking over of control of institutions and living circumstances by black people. And he goes on and he talks about violence. He's like, pay attention. All through the media, there is bullshit causing your interpretation of the world to lean in the direction of the status quo, to lean in the direction where you affirm the existing power structure. He's like, okay, how about cowboy and Indian movies? In cowboy and Indian movies, if there's battle and sometimes the Indians win, and when the Indians win, they massacre the whites. But then when the whites win, I forget what the term is that he uses. They have a victory over the Indians. Massacre, victory. Negative, positive. If you're not looking out for the way that terms are used, if you're not looking for the propagandistic spin that is always imposed, you're going to be a tool of those in power, even if you would like it to be otherwise. You have to start by defining your terms. Another example, and this is still true today, Carmichael's talking about Vietnam. He says, okay, in Vietnam, when Ho Chi Minh's army, when the VC achieved something militarily, it is said that Viet Cong terrorists killing women and children, blah, 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 blah. Now, it's probably true, except for the terrorist part, because terrorist is a meaningless word, except as part of a targeting process. You call somebody a terrorist in order to shoot them, right? Probably true that they killed women and children, but that might not have been their primary objective. But it's war. It's ugly. There's a lot of death. What about when the Americans have some kind of military achievement in Vietnam? Oh, they bomb targets. The VC kill women and children. the U.S. airmen who can feel good about themselves, and we can feel good about them, and we can all be patriots because we know we're good. They bomb targets, as if targets did not include women and children. And of course, the killing that was achieved by the United States in Vietnam exponentially exceeded any of the killing that the Vietnamese did of Americans. If we don't look out for the way this language works, we'll be perpetually reaffirmed in our belief that we're good, our system is as it should be, our leaders are good, things are as they should be, and even injustices around us, police shooting of black people, will get ignored because this dominant interpretation is coming from elsewhere. One key act for becoming independent, one key act for beginning to rebel, I said previously, was to think for yourself. This is just another version of that, is to define terms for yourself. Last term that I'll talk about, and then I'll just make a concluding comment. Your enemy. We accept very easily who the enemy is. And we can think about this in a couple of different ways. So, North Korea is supposedly our enemy. Do you know anyone in North Korea? How then can they be your enemy? Russia is supposed to be our enemy. Have you ever met Russians? I have. They're kind of just like people. Why should they be my enemy? People in the Middle East, maybe, if you go super conservative, then we'll believe that all Muslims are our enemies. I've met Muslim people. They're not my enemy. I've met conservatives. They came closer to being my enemy. And then Carmichael looks specifically at soldiers. He's really taking soldiers to task here. Now, these ROTC people on campus, we think of them as being patriots. We think of them as being brave, but they don't have the balls, and here I'm paraphrasing Stokely, they don't have the spirit, they don't have the courage to define enemies for themselves. You become a soldier, you get trained up, you're dropped into a situation, and the person above you says, hey, dude, there's your enemy over there. That dude hates America. Fuck him up. And this alleged courageous person goes ahead and does that. Kills this man over here. Maybe kills a woman over here. Accidentally kills a child over here. Intentionally kills a child over here. All because somebody else told him who the enemy was. Carmichael is desperate. We have to define our enemies for ourselves. And it's not that he's not nonviolent, right? It's not that we don't have enemies. It's that we should be more honest about who our enemies are. For a person living in an American ghetto, maybe the enemy is the police. Maybe for American labor, the enemy is the capitalist. We have to define enemies on the basis of our own experience. That's a big step to believe that you have an enemy. I mean, to say that you have an enemy means that action is required. Potentially violent action is required. We have to take that step ourselves. We cannot allow other people to take that step for us. Okay, so this is the point. The last, little detail that Carmichael talks about here. It's like, now think about how people talk about violence. And especially think about how they talk about so-called riots, which probably we ought better to call rebellions. In riots, people are always wondering, like, why are all these black people destroying their own neighborhoods? They're just out of control and they're crazy. Why are they so violent? I mean, one answer to that is, well, probably the stuff that gets destroyed in a rebellion, like the Watts Rebellion, is in large part not actually the property of the people who destroy it, but of people from outside the community who make a profit off of the people inside it, and profit specifically from the fact that the people inside a particular community have no means by which to leave. There's a connection to Fanon too, right? So we know, it sort of seems to be true, that so-called ghetto communities have more violence than other communities. And he's like, but what violence do they really care about? And what violence do the cops care about? What violence do the upper class people care about? What violence do the whites care about? They're like, the ghetto has the greatest amount of shootings, stabbings, whatever, in the city, but it also has the greatest number of cops per square foot, greater concentration of cops. He's like, so what does that mean? It means that the violence that's happening between people within poor communities is of no concern to the cops. let the black people kill one another. Remember, go back to Fanon. Fanon had a whole theory about what's going on with black on black, gang on gang violence. It's like, well, you know, they just haven't figured out who their real enemy is. The cops over here don't care if they kill one another. And they don't arrive, you know, it takes them an hour. If there's an emergency, 2 hours. But the moment that this group of people over here turns its gaze away from one another and turns it towards a bank, a department store, they break a window. Maybe they go and they take stuff from inside, which, by the way, Baldwin will say they don't take the TV because they want the TV. They take the TV to say, fuck you, I exist. If they do that, now, it seems like this is a lesser thing, right? Because no humans are getting killed if the use of force has been turned now towards property, private property, that is owned from outside the community, because hardly anything is owned within the community if you're talking about a super poor community. At that point, woo, 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 cops are there in 5 minutes, 3 minutes, 2 minutes. They're completely, earnestly opposed to this violence. So Carmichael's, what they really don't want is an attack on private property. They don't give a shit about attack on bodies. So watch out for what is called violence. And he concludes with this position, which I think is a basically revolutionary position. And that is, what's really going on here is an opposition between private property and human rights. And the structure as it now exists, including especially the police, are in place in order to protect private property, but not to protect rights. Okay, so questions. What associations do you have about the Black Power movement? How would you define violence? Is what police do and what soldiers do violence in the same way as what, I don't know if these people actually exist, you know, robbers. Like, all my kids always watching these, you know, cartoons. There's always robbers and bad guys. And I'm always like, dude, there's no, it's not that simple. Is what authorities do violence, or can violence only be carried out by people who are not authorities? Do you think that one should categorically prefer non-violent protest? Is that the only possible valid protest, or is that just one among many possible forms of resistance? Should a community that is objectively under attack, it's being shot in the back over and over and over, should it consider defending itself? Should it arm itself? Oh, and maybe lastly, can you think of other instances where terms are defined for us and this is a problem? And can you imagine what it would mean if we were defining terms for ourselves?